Hope your week is off to a great start. I'm Min Sun-hee with our panel of foreign journalists. Welcome to the show.
Good to be back, thanks.
As always, let's begin with a few words on some of your coverage. We'll start with you, Koichi.
I interviewed several Korean ex-officials who was in charge of South and North dialogue between 2009 to 2011. And this dialogue led to a leap day deal between US and North Korea. It was a failed deal, but still, it was the latest and last dialogue on nuclear issue between Western countries and North Korea. So I think it's important to look back that period of time.
Of course. Elise, what have you been covering?
Yeah, international audiences are still interested in North Korea, so ongoing back and forth and what KCNA says about the latest UN sanctions.
위협과 제재 소동에 대한 실제적 대응 조치의 일환으로서 적들이 우리를 건드린다면 우리도 맞받아칠 준비가 되어 있다는
이런 상황에서는 대화도 불가능합니다. 북한이 진정한 대화의 길로 놓을 수밖에 없도록 국제사회의 제재와 압박이 한층 더 억제어질 것입니다.
Same type of thing. I've been following, of course, the repercussions from North Korea's recent nuclear test and the process going through the United Nations and the battle within the United Nations between the US and its allies essentially and China and Russia to tone down what was that resolution that still puts some serious sanctions on Pyongyang.
Right. And staying with North Korea, in the wake of its sixth nuclear test earlier this month, South Korea has installed additional launches for a controversial US anti-missile system. As expected, the move has triggered fierce debate, both here in the country and elsewhere in the region. 4 additional THAAD missile defense launches have been deployed on the Korean peninsula. On September 6, the government spoke of plans to install the remaining 4 launches at Seongju County, Gyeongsangbuk-do Province. The following day, the plans were put into action. The Defense Ministry has emphasized that the THAAD deployment is a temporary move to counter an escalating nuclear and missile threat from North Korea. Yet the installment of the 4 launches reportedly completes the deployment of a single THAAD battery.
고도화되는 북한의 핵 미사일 위협으로부터 우리 국민의 생명과 안전을 보호하기 위한 조치의 일환으로 주한미군 사드 체계 잔여 발사대 4기를 오늘 임시 배치하였습니다.
The deployment itself had been agreed between Seoul and Washington under the Park Geun-hye administration. While the Moon administration emphasized procedural legitimacy in explaining its decision, issues regarding the omission of a THAAD report and an environmental impact assessment has caused much criticism.
절차적 정당성을 획득할 수 있도록 국방부의 법령에 따른 적정한 환경 영향 평가 절차를 진행하라고 말했습니다.
On July 29th, following North Korea's intercontinental ballistic missile test, President Moon Jae-in ordered for a temporary deployment of the remaining 4 THAAD launches. And on September 7th, following North Korea's 6th nuclear test 4 days earlier, the remaining 4 THAAD missile launches were installed 40 days after it had been ordered for temporary deployment. The decision has triggered much opposition. Residents at Seongju County in Gyeongsangbuk-do Province who live in the area of the THAAD deployment immediately denounced the decision.
박근혜 정부에서 4월 26일 날 사드 불법 배치하는 것과 뭐가 다릅니까?
The Liberal Party also has strongly criticized President Moon Jae-in for going against his presidential election pledge.
절차도 효용성도 인식되지 않았다며 사드 배치를 반대했던 후보 시절의 약속은 어디로 갔습니까?
And President Moon, aware of the criticism, claimed in writing that it was an inevitable choice for national security. The controversy surrounding the THAAD deployment is expected to continue for the time being. So, Koichi, what are your thoughts on the Moon administration's decision to deploy the additional launches?
It was inevitable because it's beyond the military and strategic meaning that THAAD deployment is a symbolic gesture of strong U.S. ROK ties and alliance. So I think it was necessary.
It was necessary. Elise, do you share these views, Koichi's?
I also thought it was inevitable in that under the Park Geun-hye administration, the beginning of this deployment already started, and so for him to walk it back was always going to be, him meaning President Moon, to walk it back was always going to be politically delicate and treacherous, really.
I agree with my colleagues here. I think it would have been really very, very difficult for him to somehow walk it back or have the two launchers that had been initially installed by the Park Geun-hye administration removed. He handled it, I think, delicately during the campaign, where he didn't say that he was going to remove it, but said that the next government should make a decision there. And I think North Korea's recent nuclear test really, and recent missile launch also really sort of cast the die in terms of what he had to do. I agree it was inevitable.
And of course, the international media also covered the event, the installment of the additional launches. I assume the Japanese media also covered this event. What was the focus of their coverage, Koichi?
Of course, we covered massively because it's a matter of relationship between three very important countries in East Asia, China, Korea, and US. And, of course, we focused on the relationship between US and ROK and China.
Right. You've all agreed that the decision was inevitable, but regardless of that, the Moon administration is facing much criticism from both the Conservatives and the Liberals. The Conservatives are accusing the government of having created much divide by postponing the deployment, while the Liberals claim that the government, the new administration, has violated a campaign pledge. Elise, what are your thoughts?
Is it fair to say that the deployment was really postponed? Because you could arguably say that it was fast-tracked after we've seen more and more provocations from North Korea. Because while there is still this environmental review going on, the deployment of these new launchers went ahead despite the ongoing review. Or, I mean, there was a tacit approval of that environmental question. So I guess I would quibble with the notion that, that there was any sort of delay.
Frank, in your opinion, how could the new administration deal with this latest dilemma?
Well, I think it's going to have a really tough time. The Moon administration will have a very tough time dealing with this. I think because of what happened, the last two incidents, the missile launch and the nuclear test, the tide changed in South Korean public opinion toward North Korea. Not only do you find, I believe, more support for THAAD, but you also have support for South Korea obtaining nuclear weapons. And that's really, to me, quite worrying. When I went out into the street and I interviewed a lot of people, and I was astonished at the number of people and the types of people, young people that I would normally, suggest would be somewhat progressive, more likely to say, no, we shouldn't get nuclear weapons. Even if they get nuclear weapons, we still shouldn't do it. Those types of people were saying, yes, we need to get nuclear weapons now. That, to me, is much more extreme than the deployment of THAAD, and I think those people obviously would be in favor of THAAD as well.
Also, North Korea helped to solve this President Moon's dilemma because of the sixth nuclear test.
Right.
Just to expand on something Koichi said about the symbolic nature of THAAD, I think that's really important. I don't think that this is a very accurate deterrence for North Korea. It really is purely symbolic. There are 48 launchers. It can easily be overwhelmed in the case of a conflict on the Korean Peninsula with North Korea's weapons, and it doesn't protect the capital Seoul. But some people I talked to, they said, you know, we have to do something. And really, I think that something was deploying THAAD, even though it isn't a very useful defensive weapon.
Right, and we'll get back to that later in the program. In recent days, President Moon's approval ratings have also taken a slight plunge. Is this phenomenon also inevitable? Because from the 70s range, it dropped to, I believe, the 60% range. What are your thoughts, Elise?
Which is still double that of the American president, so that's huge. I mean, that's an American president, any American president in modern age, including Barack Obama, would love to have a 60% approval rating. That's incredible. So yes, it is inevitable that a president's approval rating will drop after the honeymoon period, but to drop to 60% is still quite impressive.
Right. Opposition parties have also claimed that the new administration's handling of North Korea and THAAD are clear indications of flaws in its diplomatic and security policies.
South Korea is in a difficult position, you know, not just vis-a-vis North Korea, but also because of China and Japan. It will always sort of have this tendency to look upon the United States as its security guarantor. There's been a lot of talk in South Korea with the development of the kill chain system and other aspects of its military policy, regaining wartime operational control. There might be some time in the future when South Korea can disengage from that intense security alliance relationship with the United States. And I would certainly advocate that, but I don't think that's something that can be done in the near term.
Do you believe that ultimately the installment of the anti-missile system here on the Korean Peninsula will serve Seoul well? I mean, given the fallout with Beijing and public debate, things don't look that promising at the moment, Frank.
Well, I don't think it'll ever serve Seoul well. I think this is a perfect example of a security dilemma where you think you're generating greater security for your country through weapons spending and so-called deterrence, when in fact you're generating greater risk. And this is what THAAD really does to I think the people here in South Korea.
Elise, what are your thoughts? Do you share Frank's views?
Well, it certainly adds economic risk to the people in South Korea because of what's effectively Chinese sanctions on South Korean companies, or at least one major South Korean chaebol, as a result of that. And so, but more too. I mean, I was thinking of Lotte, but now I'm thinking of Hyundai too, which is also getting affected by China's ire about THAAD. And so this security issue for a system that is admittedly questionable and then doesn't protect Seoul from conventional artillery, which is what Seoul is at risk of from North Korea. So this system, in trying to solve a security question, it has bled over into creating an economic problem. And so in that way, I think THAAD is really questionable.
Right, in this next report, we explore the ongoing controversy surrounding the deployment of THAAD, both here in the country and in the region. The decision to deploy the additional THAAD launches followed much security concerns on the Korean Peninsula. China, meanwhile, has been most vocal about its opposition to Seoul's decision. China's foreign ministry lodged a formal complaint to Kim Chang-soo, the South Korean ambassador to China.
愿再次敦促美韩重视中国等地区国家的安全利益和关切，停止有关部署进程。
China's official newspaper Global Times crudely criticized the additional deployment of THAAD in an editorial. The newspaper claimed conservatives in Korea who support the THAAD deployment have become stupid from eating kimchi only. The paper also warned that when the THAAD deployment is indeed complete, South Korea will become duckweed amidst North Korea's nuclear crisis and the past struggle of leading countries. Another official media, the People's Daily, stated the deployment of THAAD on the Korean Peninsula is not a solution to North Korea's nuclear issue, adding that the United States is taking advantage of the situation on the peninsula and using tensions here as a security strategy. Meanwhile, some have questioned the effectiveness of the missile system itself. China's Global Times on September 8th cited a military expert's remarks in an article. The expert stated that the THAAD cannot protect South Korea because it's impossible to prevent North Korea's intercontinental ballistic missiles and long-range missiles. In March, The Diplomat, a magazine specializing in U.S. security, quoted an honorary professor at MIT who claimed that THAAD's contribution to South Korean defense will be the lowest, adding that THAAD can harm South Korea's security. Meanwhile, the UN Security Council voted on a new sanctions resolution against North Korea on September 11th. The resolution calls for a 30% reduction of oil supplies to North Korea and a ban on exports of textile.
We are done trying to prod the regime to do the right thing. We are now acting to stop it from having the ability to continue doing the wrong thing.
China and Russia also voted in favor of this new resolution, which had been watered down from an earlier resolution calling for a full ban on crude oil supplies to North Korea.
中方一贯坚持实现朝鲜半岛无核化，坚持维护半岛和平稳定，坚持通过对话协商解决问题。
The additional deployment of THAAD launchers has caused much opposition, and the Moon administration has yet to deal with the latest situation. Some of the Chinese media's denunciation of Seoul's decision to deploy THAAD has been shocking, to say the least. As I said in the report, Global Times questioned whether Korean conservatives in support of THAAD had become stupid, having consumed too much kimchi. What are your thoughts on this, Koichi?
Well, it's a Global Times, and you know, you shouldn't take that seriously. I mean, but my point of view is, you know, while North Korea is producing so many missiles, South Korea and US should do something. And, you know, we can't stop North Korea, then we have to do something.
Right. Elise, the paper, Global Times, also called Seoul a pawn of Washington in the latter's containment of Beijing, containment against Beijing. What are your thoughts on that?
Okay, again, this is the Global Times, which is the most nationalistic, somewhat racist paper that is very focused on influencing international readers with its Chinese propaganda, I guess you can call it that. And so it always has to be taken with that in mind. The context is important. But, you know, that criticism that South Korea has become a client state or has been a client state of the United States has always existed, which is the argument for some of the political parties here, that the military here be able to stand on its own. That this debate has gone on for a long time. I just think that is a particularly rough-edged, rather bombastic way to enter the debate.
Frank, the media in China also claims that the deployment itself will push the Korean Peninsula closer to war.
I agree with some of the things that they said. Aside from the kimchi remark, I eat some kimchi. I don't know if it's affected me negatively. I hope not. I think it kind of, you know, wakes you up a little bit, it being so spicy. However, the idea that Seoul and South Korea is being used by the United States to contain China is legitimate criticism. The military bases here are being redeveloped into larger so-called super bases, to better ferry equipment around the region, and I feel that is a reasonable criticism. And again, as I mentioned before, I would advocate South Korea developing a stronger and more independent military posture, and that's something that Moon Jae-in is working toward.
Korean businesses operating in China, we've talked about this before, have been facing the brunt of the fallout between the two countries in light of THAAD. How long do you suppose, Koichi, will this continue?
Well, we have to wait and see until at least October 18th, which the time they will have a big party congress. And before the party congress, as you know, it's so important in the context of Chinese internal politics. Nobody have time to think about new foreign policy. And also, some people say that after the party congress, China-ROK relationship will be better. But also, others say Xi Jinping will be stronger and more confident. Then he will take same position against South Korea. So we don't know. I think we have to wait.
Right, only time will tell.
Yeah.
Elise, international efforts to isolate North Korea continue. We have Mexico expelling its North Korean ambassador. Do you believe such efforts will help to deter North Korea's provocations?
They haven't proven to work. We could see a slowdown in the number of the provocations following the sixth test because it seems as though North Korea wanted to build up to this particular one. So it could just be a confluence of timing or coincidence of timing where after the sixth test and then some of these typical measures to condemn and the latest sanctions package that we will happen to see a little bit of a break or a little bit of a slowdown. But that doesn't mean that the relationship is causal, that just because that these things happen that North Korea is slowing down. They might have reached this particular milestone and haven't hit a natural slowdown, so we'll see.
I agree with Elise on this. I think really the timing of the test and the volume of the test is more dependent on where North Korea is in its nuclear and missile program. The question is, how are they going to behave after that? Other than the nuclear and missile tests, the so-called provocations of North Korea have been somewhat limited over the last several years. Is that something that we're going to see after they are a genuine nuclear weapon state? Are we going to see North Korea sort of stand pat, as I would say, and not engage in other type of so-called asymmetrical provocations and reduce those? And that I think is a serious question.
Elise mentioned the UN sanctions, the latest ones in response to North Korea's sixth nuclear test. Now, these sanctions, the new resolution was watered down in light of opposition from China and Russia to tougher sanctions. What, Koichi, might be some ways to encourage a more hardline stance from these two countries?
Actually, this resolution is, from my perspective, pretty tough because, this ban the importing of all the textiles from North Korea, and it will hit North Korean economy severely. So I think China is doing quite well on this sanction. We shouldn't think that this sanction will work very fast. It doesn't change North Korean mind immediately. We have to be patient. And this kind of sanction should go on maybe some years, many years. Then we might be able to find some opening window of meaningful dialogue. So the most important thing is we have to cooperate, including Russia and China, for this sanction. And this is not the time for kind of a blame game. So I think we are all in the same team when it comes to denuclearize Korean Peninsula.
Elise, what are your thoughts as an American journalist on these sanctions, the latest ones?
They're always called the toughest ever, and yet we don't see any difference in behavior. My thoughts are that the existing sanctions programs are already quite heavily rule-laden and difficult to implement, and not all countries are implementing them. And at the state level, there's, even in China, a state that has a lot of control. The state can't control a lot of these individual border businessmen that are making money by being middlemen between North Korea and China and the supplies. And so we saw some evidence that maybe there were Ukrainian parts involved in the latest tests. And so there's questions about what other sort of illegal things are going on. The longer North Korea is isolated, there is an argument that the longer that North Korea is isolated, the more independent it gets in working around sanctions, in the way that bacteria-resistant bugs work, right? So like if you get a virus and that virus, not to say that North Korea is a virus, but just as a comparison, you get a virus and you feed it a lot of antibiotics, sometimes because it's had to deal with so many antibiotics, it becomes even stronger. It becomes a superbug because those antibiotics have stopped working. And so at some point, sanctions really have a limitation because of that, because North Korea gets better at working around them.
And God forbid that is the reality, right? Frank, what, in your opinion, are some of the ways that the new administration could take to improve relations with Beijing and at the same time ease tensions on the Korean Peninsula?
Getting back to North Korea and denuclearization, I think that ship sailed several years ago. A lot of analysts feel the same way. I think having THAAD being temporary means that the removal of THAAD would be contingent on the denuclearization of North Korea. I don't see North Korea denuclearizing. I think that after this sort of cycle of testing, when North Korea feels confident that it has that capability again, then we might be able to see some type of negotiations on a drawdown of tension and on the Korean Peninsula. But denuclearization of North Korea now, to me, is something of a fiction that's unlikely to take place.
In a recent public survey regarding THAAD, 8 out of 10 respondents expressed support, adding that the deployment was necessary. Last year, 5 out of 10 expressed support. Now, the change in public sentiment regarding THAAD is perhaps a clear indication of the change in national sentiment regarding security in the region. Thank you for watching.